Welcome everyone! Today we'll see Black playing an opening that's rare on the highest levels, but that's guaranteed to give us a very exciting game. This was played between Vassily Ivanchuk and Dmitry Andreikin in the Capablanca Memorial in 2011. Now without further ado, Ivanchuk had white and opened with d4, knight to f6, and after c4, Andreikin went for one of the most aggressive defenses against 1d4 with c5, so he's inviting Ivanchuk to play into the Benoni, and of course Ivanchuk does that with the space-gaining move d5. Now the Benoni is a very combative defense. In the modern Benoni, Black first sets up with g6 and bishop g7, so Black has a very strong bishop on the king side. And next Black will play d6 and later try to undermine White's pawns with e6 and a6 and b5. Still, it's not a popular defense at all at the top level, because Black's giving a big space advantage to White, so if Black fails to undermine White's pawns, he'll just be suffering. Well, let's see what happened. g6, knight to c3, White wants to go e2, e4. After bishop g7, e4 was played. So White gets this massive pawn center, sometimes White even goes f2, f4 as well, and it's not always easy to get meaningful counterplay for Black. d6 makes sure that White doesn't go e5, and also it opens up the bishop. Chucky now developed his knight to e2, because after castles he wants a knight on g3. Exactly this position can also be reached in the King's Indian, by the way. Let me quickly show that. After d4, knight f6, c4 and g6, we first get the standard opening moves, knight to c3, bishop g7, e4, d6, and here White can also go knight from g to e2, and after castles, knight to g3, c5 and d5, you can see we've reached the exact position as in the game. Going back, Ivanchuk played knight to g3, and now Andreikin continued in Benoni style with a6. He wants the typical counterplay with b5, but Ivanchuk stops that for now with a4, e6 trying to undermine White's pawns, and after bishop e2, ed5 and cd5, we have this typical Benoni pawn structure on c5, d5, d6 and e4. Typically, White would like to advance his center pawns with f4 and e5. Black therefore wants to put pressure down the e-file to prevent White's pawns coming up the board, and Black will also try to break on the queen side with b5. However, in this game, Black's going for yet another strategy, just wait and see. First though, Black develops his knight, castles, rook e8, the normal moves, and here Ivanchuk creates this very solid pawn chain after f3, which again is also common in the King's Indian. Now rook to b8, planning b7, b5, but after bishop to e3, hoping to trade bishops after queen to d2, Andreikin went h5, which has two ideas. First, he wants to drive away the knight from g3 with h4, and maybe even advance further with h3 to destabilize White's king position. And second, he wants to go knight to h7 and then attack White's pawn center with f7, f5. I like h5. I've actually seen Andreikin play this way before. That was also in 2011 against Dominguez, but there he played it in a variation of the Sicilian. There the pawn did go all the way to h3 and he won a nice game. Anyway, queen to d2, knight to h7. White has to be a little careful. As I said, Black wants to go f5, and then the dark squared bishop can be vulnerable on e3. Let me quickly show you how. If, for example, rook from a to b1, then f5, and if White would take, then Black can simply take the bishop, because of course if queen takes, then bishop to d4 wins the queen. Therefore Ivanchuk is going for this exchange, but now that the knight is no longer on f6, Black also has this check. White brought the bishop back, and the Black bishop just returned to g7, but Ivanchuk had something in mind. He went rook from f to d1, which stops Black from playing that rook takes e3 sacrifice, because if again f5, pawn takes and rook takes, now White can take, because after bishop to d4, White can just hack that off, and White would be winning in this case. Going back, that's why Andreikin didn't play f5 but h4, and after knight to f1, h3 to weaken the pawn cover of white's king. g3 keeps the king side closed, so an attack on the king side isn't really that promising for black right now. Therefore Andreikin is going for other typical counterplay on the queen side with b5. That is giving up a pawn, but in return black will try to use the open b file. But first knight to e5, which sets up a little tactic. He wants to play rook takes knight, and when the bishop takes, then knight takes f3 check would win the queen. Therefore knight to c3. But now Andreikin really went for it with f5. Now he's playing on the king side again, and it's actually not that comfortable for white. Yes, he still has more space, and he has an extra pawn now, but the pawn on h3 is a long-term worry for the king. The center pawns are under fire, the b pawn is isolated and targeted. Andreikin must have been reasonably happy with this position. But Ivanchuk wasn't going to sit around, he's going for activity of his own. First, rook to a7, and you may think, well, what about queen to b6, just hitting the rook and the b pawn? That was indeed black's move, but now Ivanchuk sacrifices the rook for the bishop, which may seem drastic at first, but it is logical. First, now white's dark squared bishop doesn't have an opponent, so black will have issues on the dark squares. And second, psychologically it's also a good decision, because after Andreikin played b5, he thought he was getting the initiative, but now Ivanchuk is taking the initiative for himself. And there's actually a third point as well. After king takes, b4 was played. Of course the c pawn is pinned, the b pawn was a liability, but now it's actually helping white in the attack. First of all though, isn't queen takes possible? It doesn't lose, but it's definitely not black's best. Here white would play rook to b1. Now black has to take, otherwise the rook on b8 drops. So queen takes, knight takes, rook takes. Now black ends up with two rooks for the queen, which is good on paper, but white can start opening up the center, for example f4. If then knight to g4, white trades that off. And after queen to c2 and rook to b4, white can go e5. Now white's pawns are dangerous anyway, but black's c and d pawns will be weak, and white's opening up lines to the black king. Also black doesn't really have any threats of his own anymore, so certainly this doesn't feel like black's best choice. Andreikin decided to play actively with bishop to a6, actually provoking the b pawn forward, and after b5 he just took that. Remember, white still has to reckon with that knight on e5, knight takes f3 check could again be happening, so he took with the knight, and after the recapture, not bishop takes queen, but f4, Andreikin again finds the best move. Black shouldn't try knight to c4, because queen c3 check is a simple double attack and black loses the piece for nothing. Instead, queen to a4, which was played in the game, is much better. He parts with the knight anyway, but at least white does drop some pawns now. First, queen takes e4, bishop check, king to g8, and then Chucky brought his knight in the game again. I think Andreikin played this really practically. As I said in other videos, when you're up material, always keep in mind that it's sometimes best to give some material back. It can relieve the pressure from your position, or your opponent has to compromise in another way. In this case, Ivanchuk doesn't have this great pawn center anymore. The e5 pawn is also hanging, black can take it in both ways, and Andreikin chose queen takes, bishop f4, queen e7, keeping an eye on the d6 pawn. But after bishop to d3, Andreikin did play an inaccuracy. He played the natural knight to f6, but this forces him into a more passive position. It was best to defend actively with rook to b4, and the point is that after knight to c4 targeting the d pawn, to go rook takes knight, and after bishop takes, g5 wins the material back. White then takes on d6, but after the recapture, white doesn't have an advantage anymore, and for the moment he's even a pawn down. After the game continuation, white again goes knight to c4, the pawn is again hanging, and now he has no choice but to defend passively with one of the rooks. And in a time that black's pieces are somewhat disorganized, Ivanchuk has the time to win one of black's weak pawns. First, bishop to g5. Now the knight is also tied up. Queen f7, queen to b2. pressuring the knight again, and it avoids getting hit with knight to e4. Rook to f8 defends the knight. And what is black's weakest pawn? It's that pesky h-pawn, but bishop to f1 will simply pick that up. Andreikin hurried to again get active somehow with rook to b8, and after queen to c1, knight to e4, at least the knight occupies an active square now, and after bishop takes pawn, he dropped the rook down to b3, getting as active as he possibly can. Now the threat is rook to c3, therefore bishop to f1 covering the knight. But now, unfortunately for Andreikin, after all this work he did make a critical mistake. I'm sure there was time trouble. He now played f4. He wants to open up white's king, and he must have thought that bishop takes pawn wasn't possible because black would go g5. Unfortunately though, that wasn't correct. Instead of f4, he could have simply doubled rooks as a quick but logical move to get to the time control, and he would have been fine. But after f4, he's simply losing that pawn. Ivanchuk took, and after g5, he could simply take on d6, attacking queen and knight. So black has to trade, and then the bishop saves itself by recapturing on d6. The game is over now. The check on f2 isn't dangerous. Since black dropped the f-pawn, he also cannot clear away white's kingside pawns, and it turns out black's king is less safe than white's. It didn't go on much longer. After rook to f5, white took another pawn, also attacking the queen, and after queen to a2, bishop to c4 wins even more material, and Andreikin resigned. Well, I think a great game by both players. I started out by saying the Benoni is a risky choice at the top level, but Andreikin actually got a decent position. He managed to play on all sides of the board, he sacked a pawn for activity. He was never really better, but Ivanchuk only got a clear advantage at the very end when Andreikin made that single mistake by going f4. Chess can be very tough. Anyway, let me know in the comments what you think of this game. If you enjoyed, please do me a favor and simply like the video, and feel free to check out many more games in the playlist. I'll be seeing you guys again soon, and take care.